AC problems. We're having technical problems. Is there any sound now?
Yes.
All right, we got sound now. Whether it's good sound or not is another question, but
Actually, it did sound pretty good too.
but we got sound. So we are working on the microphone on the phone, and that's it. So, all right. So he's not questioning his own belief or confidence in what he's preached. He's gone there, I would suggest to you, under direction of God, for the very purpose of what we were talking about during the introduction. So there could be this conversation and a comparing of Gospels to confirm to everyone what truth? That they in fact were preaching the same things, despite the fact that they had not spoken to one another or received their gospel through some agreement between them. And so this is the way in which it becomes apparent. And the record that we have here in Galatians 2 is the way that it becomes apparent to us. We would have no way of knowing about this except for it was recorded here. So he goes back after 14 years, and that's after 3 years. So then we're at 17 years after his conversion, at least at this point. It's the first time he goes and sits down with those that he says who are of reputation. What's he talking about there? Who would be of reputation at the church in Jerusalem? Okay. Possibly some people who were important Jews who had been converted, but more importantly, who stayed in Jerusalem, even when the persecution arose against the church, who all stayed in Jerusalem? The apostles. So the apostles are there. I would submit to you that number one, the apostles were men of reputation.
Mine says influential.
Influential. I think the brother of the Lord, James, who became an elder of the church there, would be probably among them. Influential. Talk about the people. We're talking about the other apostles and other people who were eyewitnesses of the things that happened to Jesus and of his resurrection and those types of things that he went to speak with. Now, well, I won't get into that discussion until the text gets to it. So he went up there. He says, I submitted to them the gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but I did so in private to those who were of reputation, for fear that I might be running or had run in vain. Again, he didn't think that his preaching was useless. So what was he afraid of? I find this kind of interesting, and it's very telling. I think there's an important thing to learn here.
He's afraid of being stopped short before he finishes what he's sent to do.
Okay. Potentially. I think it shows that he had some reservations about how he would be received by these influential people in Jerusalem. He wasn't sure if they would embrace him and his message or not. Now, he was there because, what reason? Did he go to Jerusalem because he woke up one morning and said, you know what, I need to go to Jerusalem? No, he went kind of against his will. He was sent by revelation to go. And so he knew God wanted him to be there, but he still wasn't certain that he would be received by the brethren very warmly. He also had two people with him. Who did he bring along?
Barnabas and Titus.
Barnabas and Titus. Now, Barnabas, we find out, was someone that the church of Jerusalem was somewhat familiar with, right? Because he's actually the one who talked them into receiving Paul when he went back to Jerusalem and sought to identify with the church there. Titus is another story. Titus was not Jewish, apparently. Was Titus circumcised?
He says he wasn't forced to be.
He was not circumcised. Now, there's several things we need to keep under consideration. And we're starting to get introduced into exactly what kind of twisting of the gospel he's addressing, the problem that he's addressing here. He introduces that Titus was with him so he can talk about the things pertaining to Titus in the coming verses that he's going to talk about. Part of what they were doing was teaching
Circumcision.
Circumcision was
The keeping of the law was
required in order to be forgiven and saved. And the teachers that went out from Jerusalem are the ones who were teaching that. You remember the story of Acts 15, right? That's where they had come from. And so this is the hot seat of this idea that you had to be circumcised in order to be a faithful Christian. And he's walking in there with a guy that's not circumcised. And he wasn't sure how they would receive them. And whether they would approve of what he was doing. So that's what he's talking about when he says, for fear that I might be running or had run in vain. The whole process of going and talking to the people in Jerusalem may turn out to be a pointless endeavor if nothing good comes out of it. That's what he's afraid of, is that they're not going to accept him. But listen to what he says. But not even Titus, who was with me, though he was a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. Now, this is an interesting verse for what reason? Anybody have any record from other Bible study that gives us any value as to why that statement is significant? Who else was close to Paul? What's another name that you associate with the Apostle Paul?
Timothy.
Timothy. What do we know about Timothy? Tell me about Timothy's background.
His mother and grandmother were Jewish.
His mother and grandmother were Jewish. In fact, that's where he learned the Old Testament scriptures, right? What about his dad?
Not so much.
Not a Jew. So was Timothy circumcised? Not on the 8th day.
Good answer.
Not in his youth. I don't know how old he was when he started hanging out with Paul, but when he got ready to go with Paul on that first journey, Paul said what? Timothy, you probably ought to go be circumcised. We'll have an easier time being accepted by our Jewish brethren if you're circumcised. And so Timothy was circumcised, right? Titus was not compelled to be circumcised. Why was Timothy circumcised and Titus not circumcised?
The horse was already out of the gate by then.
Well, the horse was already out of the gate even with Timothy. But he went ahead and encouraged Timothy to be circumcised. But he said that Titus wasn't compelled. Listen, it's important to note that what he's saying is that those people didn't force Titus to be circumcised. Again, we're talking about people who are teaching that circumcision is required. And so this is an important piece of information. And there is an important contrast we need to be aware of. And we need to be asking ourselves the question. We read something like this, we ought to immediately ask the question, well, why would he have Timothy circumcised and not tell Titus to be circumcised for the same reason that he told Timothy to be circumcised? And we're going to get the answer to that question as we move through this, if we're paying attention and looking for an answer to that question. So that's what he says. Not even Titus, who was with me, though he was Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. But it was because of the false brethren who had sneaked in to spy out our liberty we have in Christ Jesus in order to bring us into bondage. We did not yield in subjection to them for even an hour, so that the truth of the gospel might remain with you. So here he's saying, listen, I went to Jerusalem to the hot seat of this teaching, and I had a Greek man with me, and not even he was compelled to be circumcised, and I wouldn't yield to that for one moment. Why? so that the truth of the gospel might remain with you, so that people would know. Here's the difference. The difference is someone doing something voluntarily, not out of an act of faith or a belief that it's an act of faith, Timothy, for the benefit of being able to preach the gospel to people who are not believers. And Titus among believers who are twisting the gospel and saying that people must be circumcised. And Paul says, oh no, we're not going to for a moment allow this to happen, to give the impression that anyone anywhere, particularly to the Gentiles in Galatia he's talking about here, that this nonsense that's being preached about the necessity of circumcision is true. It was because of false brethren. False brethren, he calls them. What does that mean? They were in error, who were trying to upset and destroy the faith of people. He said, we didn't yield in subjection to them for even an hour so that the truth of the gospel might remain with you. We wanted to be certain that the true gospel was supported for the very same reason that Titus was circumcised. And Timothy was circumcised, Titus was not. For the very same reason. To support the spread of the truth of the gospel. Yes, sir.
Did you say he encouraged?
He encouraged Timothy to.
When?
I'd have to look it up. I don't have it off the top of my head. But before they left for their journey together, he told Timothy to be circumcised. It's recorded in Acts.
Okay, but I didn't recall that because, because he knew. He didn't have to be.
Look at Acts 16:3, Greg. Tell me if that's it. Did I pick right?
Yes.
Verse 3.
Ooh, I love it. Acts 16, and it's verse 3 particularly, but let's back up and get the context a little bit. Verse 41 of chapter 15, as he was traveling through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches, he came also to Derbe and then to Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken by the brethren who were in Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted this man to go with him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those parts, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. And so Paul knew that that was going to get in the way of Timothy's ability to be able to work with him. So he circumcised him so that it wouldn't be a problem. But it wasn't an act of faith. In this situation, Titus was not circumcised because the teaching was what? That is an act of faith. You need to be circumcised. And Titus was with Paul, and Paul wouldn't stand for a moment to allow Titus to be circumcised, lest the impression be left that Paul was in agreement with that teaching. So it was all about making certain that people knew the truth, that circumcision was not required. And yet that's part of, apparently, what was being told to these Galatian Christians, and some of them were buying into this message. I'm amazed that you're so quickly deserting him who called you for a gospel that's really not another gospel, only some are twisting it. It's the same Judaizing teaching that's dealt with in Acts 15. The same Judaizing teaching that is being addressed here in Galatia. So it says, but from those who are of high reputation, now we're going to learn something really important here. He says, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. So what's his point there? Are there really people of high reputation in the church? That's a loaded question. There's two ways to answer that question. But let's have that discussion. Are there people who are of high reputation? Let's just talk about in absolute terms. Yeah, look at Corinth. Some of them were saying, hey, Peter taught me. And some of them were saying, hey, Apollos taught me. And some of them were saying, well, Paul taught me. I was baptized by this brother. I was baptized. Were there people whose name and recognition was out there that people put respect to the association of the name? Absolutely, certainly.
It goes on today, too.
And it goes on today. Is there places of rank in the church where there actually are disciples that are more valuable or more important or of more influence than anyone else, or should be of more influence than anyone else? And the answer is no. And that's his point. These were the men of high reputation, and I sought them out and I talked to them and I shared with my gospel with them. But you know what? The truth of the matter is it makes no difference to me who they were, because God shows no partiality. Paul wasn't more important than anyone else. Peter wasn't more important than anyone else. Just because they were apostles didn't mean that they were more valuable than anyone else. And in fact, that's the point that Paul argues earlier in chapter 1, isn't it? Even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed. Yes, sir.
That brings me back to the talk back earlier in the chapter when we talked about lest I run in vain. I don't see that Paul couldn't have not have been afraid of anything.
Yeah, right. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't convinced that this whole exercise was going to actually turn out to any good end. I think that's what his point is. He went to Jerusalem because he was told to go to Jerusalem by God. He wasn't convinced that it was going to go well. So, rather than just show up in Jerusalem and start talking to everybody, he pulled the men of reputation aside, and I think he was probably talking about the apostles and elders, and addressed them directly instead of the whole body. And he's making the point now that it wasn't because he thought that they were more important than anyone else. God shows no partiality, so it makes no difference to me. He said, but those who are of reputation contributed nothing to me. And that's really where this is going. Where he's going with this is, you know what, that whole exchange, even though I went back after 14 years and I talked to these guys, I shared my gospel with them, they didn't show me that I was deficient in anything. They didn't teach me anything that I didn't know. And that's actually his point. And that's what we were talking about earlier. When the comparison actually took place, Paul said, this is what I'm teaching. And the apostles in Jerusalem said, that's what we're teaching too. And we're going to see that play out a little bit more in this discussion as he goes on. That's his point there. He's not going, well, you know, they couldn't teach me anything in an arrogant way. He was saying their gospel was the same gospel as mine. They didn't contribute something that had not been revealed to me. We had received the same message. We were teaching the same things. So listen to what he goes on to say. But on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised, for he who effectually worked for Peter in his apostleship to the circumcised, effectually worked for me also to the Gentiles. And recognizing the grace that had been given to me, James and Cephas and John, who were reputed to be pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we might go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. And so he said, look, I traveled up there. After this time, I shared with them what I was teaching, and what we all figured out is the same God who was working in Peter was working in me. The same message that Peter was preaching, I was preaching. And so these, and he names three of them here, Peter and John, who were both apostles, and James, who I think he's speaking about the Lord's brother, these three men found that he was preaching the exact same gospel as them, extended their fellowship to him, wished him well, and said, look at verse 10. They only ask us to remember the poor, the very thing I was also eager to do. And so, when they compared their teaching, his point is, going all the way back to the last part of chapter 1, is I didn't consult with anyone. The message that I preached, I received from God. And in fact, I didn't even go there, except for once for 15 days. And then I didn't go back for another 14 years. And when I went back, I sat down with these people and I said, this is what I'm teaching. And they went, that's exactly what we're teaching. And they contributed nothing new to me that hadn't been revealed to me. They hadn't received a part of the message that I had failed to receive. But in fact, they figured out that the same Spirit that was working in them was working in him. That the same authority that they preached was the authority that Paul preached. And he said they only asked us to remember the poor. Now, there's a reason for that. I want to turn your attention to Romans 15 for a moment. Is that the last bell or is that the first bell? Or is that both of them together at the same time? I feel cheated. I just want you to know that. I don't have time for this. Romans 15:26. For Macedonia and Achaia had been pleased to make some contributions for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 4. Paul instructed the church at Corinth to lay aside upon the first day of every week that they might have money so that when he came it could be given to him for what purpose? Where was it being taken? To Jerusalem. To the poor and needy in Jerusalem and Judea. Acts 24:17. Now after several years I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. He made a trip to Jerusalem to bring alms, charity, to their needs. Jerusalem, the saints in Jerusalem were the poor. And so when it says they only ask us to remember the poor, he's saying they ask us to remember them in their circumstances. Because life was not easy in Jerusalem at the time. What was going on?
Church was being heavily persecuted.
Church was being heavily persecuted. No longer just by the Jews, but now also by the Romans. Really, really nasty things. So they were in great hardship, and so he goes there and he makes his case to them, and they say, look, God's clearly at work in you just like he is with us, but please remember us in our circumstances. And he said, the very thing I was also eager to do. He wanted to help them. He wanted to remember them. He wanted to participate. And he went about actually encouraging the Gentile Christians to do what? Send to the relief of their need. He worked hard to make that happen. And so that's what that's talking about. It's important for us to see that the only thing they contributed to him was letting him know what? Of their need. Of the hardships that they were under. And the fact that they needed help. Gotta stop. Don't want to, but I have to. Thanks for your presence, participation, and for those that suffered through the no sound at the beginning, thanks for hanging on and